This is the X-Zone Broadcast Network, broadcasting worldwide on broadcast affiliates and satellite program providers, including CNN Broadcast Network, Sirius Satellite Network, Star Media, Good News Radio Network, Angel Broadcast Network, Wiki Broadcast Network, and WPBN TV. For more information on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, visit us at www.xzbn.net.
All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X-Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome to the X-Zone, everyone. My name is Rob McConnell. It is Friday, October the 2nd in the year 2015. We're coming to you live and around the world from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, on the X-Zone Broadcast Network, the Starcom Radio Network, the Digital Broadcast Network, and Digital Satellite Network. If you'd like to send an email, xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. You can always send me a Skype message to X-Zone Radio TV. Toll free worldwide, 800-610-7035. And on all social media sites, X-Zone Radio TV. Now you can listen to the X-Zone 24/7, 365, including the live show, Monday through Friday from 8 p.m. until midnight at, like I said, 24/7, 365. We have all X-Zone all the time at www.xzoneradiotv.com. X-Zone Nation, as I was saying last night, Kathleen Marden was supposed to be our guest. We were going to speak to Kathleen, who is Betty Hill's niece, but due to pressing family matters, Kathleen could not make it today. But our prayers and our thoughts are with Kathleen and her family at this time. Stanton T. Friedman, who co-authored a book with Kathleen Marden, captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, is here with us tonight. And, you know, Stanton is truly, not only is he the great-grandfather of ufology, but he's also a very kind, compassionate, and loving person. And, Stan, I want to thank you so much for sitting in tonight. It's a great pleasure having you back on the show again.
Well, it's the least I can do for Kathleen. She's got a lot of things to take care of with family problems right now, and I'm sure she'd sit in for me. So we've worked together quite a bit over the last 7 to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And we had been introduced before we started working on Captured, because I met Betty and Barney Hill way back in 1968, and I had a good media person. I'm always grateful for the fact that this was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania,
mm-hmm.
and KDKA is the big station in Pittsburgh, and I had done a show called Contact, believe it or not. That's what got me started giving lectures and so forth.
I remember that show.
Well, it was a big show.
It was.
And KDKA had a big audience,
yeah.
One of those 50,000 watt clear channel things, you know. And I did the show a number of times, and they called me one time to tell me that Betty and Barney were coming to town. And they told me where they were staying, which is very unusual, as you know.
Yeah.
They trusted me is what I'm saying. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying they did. And so I called them, and we arranged to have dinner together down at their hotel. And it was great from my viewpoint because I had read the book,
mm-hmm.
first book, The Interrupted Journey by John Fuller, and I had seen the Look magazine article, Fuller's stuff. And so I was really very curious to have an interaction with them. And we enjoyed dinner, but what I found most interesting was I couldn't find any reason to think they were enlarging upon the story. It didn't grow with time, even though there was a book out, and, Up the Journey did very well in a lot of places,
Yes.
So it was well received. And I enjoyed meeting with them, and then doing documentaries and stuff. Barney died less than 6 months later. Not because of meeting me, obviously. But he died, but I saw Betty a number of times, visited at her home, and in my movie, UFOs Are Real, a documentary movie that I was very much involved, still available on DVD, as a matter of fact. But we visited Betty. We also visited Marjorie Fish, who did the star map work that we'll be talking about. And we also visited Dr. Mitchell, who was chairman of the astronomy department at Ohio State University, who on camera says what a good job Marjorie had done.
Now, I'd just like to clarify something here, Stan. We're not talking about Dr. Edgar Mitchell here.
No, we're not.
Yeah, okay.
Nor George Mitchell, who was a senator from Maine. I forget his first name. Suddenly it's out of my head. But he was willing to go on record. Marjorie, in doing this star map, we'll get into that, but she needed access. She wanted to build three-dimensional models that showed the stars in the local neighborhood in their proper three-dimensional location. Now, that's tricky. You got to get the coordinates of the stars. I mean, you want to look at a star, you don't care how far away it is. Just what two angles do you match? But if you want to build a model that shows in the proper three-dimensional perspective, you need to know where they are. And there was lousy data available. I mean, you'd get 4 different catalogs, and you'd get different distances for stars. Things have changed drastically, and that's an important point. But so Marjorie needed access to star catalogs. She couldn't take them out of the library. Dr. Mitchell arranged so at least she could copy down by hand all those numbers for hundreds of stars. But he had his students also look at her work. And like I say, he's on camera. This goes back to 1979. He's on camera saying what a, accurate job she had done and so forth. She was a brilliant woman, very modest, and one of the most objective people I've ever met. She's dead now. And as proof of that, incidentally, she had been a school teacher in Toledo, Ohio, near Toledo, Ohio, and I had visited her there because she had told the head of APRO, you remember Coral and Jim Lorenzen.
Sure.
And she had asked Coral for, was there a scientist she could talk to about her work?
Mm-hmm.
And Coral had recommended me. And I was traveling a great deal, so I contacted Marjorie, and I arranged to see her during one of my trips. I stopped by a small town in Ohio, not far from Toledo, and met with her, and also went with her, we both went to Chicago. Dr. J. Allen Hynek met with us at the Adler Planetarium to talk to Marjorie, and she brought one of her small models. She built more than 20 models. And so I was the first to publish about the star map. And what's the name? Saga Magazine, that great, and I don't know if anybody remembers.
Sure do.
But they carried my article, and I showed my article to Terry Dickinson, who was editor of Astronomy Magazine. I'd met Terry prior to this, and suggested he might want to do an article about her work.
Mm-hmm.
And so he didn't just take my word for it. He talked to a whole bunch of people and did an article in Astronomy. First time they ever published a UFO article. Got more response than to anything else that they had published, which I think surprised Terry. But anyway, they published a number of letters over the next year. And there's a reason for telling you this. And then they put together a 32-page full-color booklet that included his original article and all the comments that they published over the next year.
Wow.
And they sold within less than a year, they sold 15,000 copies. And then Carl Sagan's lawyer threatened to sue them because his name was on the front with other people who had contributed to the discussion. And they made me an offer I couldn't refuse, and I wound up with almost 15,000 copies. I no longer have one. I mean, if I had another 15,000, I could sell them too.
I'm sure
it was
you
a nice job. Well done job. And so there was quite a surprise on that, I think, because the astronomical community hadn't realized how much interest there was in UFOs. You know, this is garbage science and all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the big guns took off after it. But anyway, I was involved with that. And when Kathy decided, maybe more than 10 years ago now, that she wanted to do a book, I have to point out here, Kathy is Betty's niece, that's true. And she heard about the case the day after it happened, because when Betty and Barney came home from their trip to Toronto and then back down New Hampshire, getting home 2 hours later than they should have and stuff like that. But they remembered a part of the sighting, not the abduction part, but this thing in the sky, which they watched for quite some time as they were driving at night. And it struck them. Betty was more impressed maybe than Barney was, but when they got home, and after sleeping a bit, they got home in the middle of the night, she called her sister, who's Kathy's mother. And it turns out Kathy's mother had had a sighting many years earlier.
Mm.
So Kathy was there in the room when her mother was talking to Betty. That's pretty quick on the spot, if you will.
Yeah.
She was not a UFO investigator at the time. But a few days later, they drove down. It was only 20 miles away to where Betty lived in Portsmouth. And they saw the spots on the car. The interesting part of this story is that when they look at the car the next day, there are these spots the size of maybe $1, a silver dollar. And when Betty called her sister, she got advice from somebody, next door neighbor, I think. Check a compass on that. And so they had a compass in the house, and they took it, and son of a gun, if it didn't go wild when you put it near one of these spots, you'd take it away, it would stop. This is weird. And so when Kathy and her family went down to see Aunt Betty and Barney, she saw the spots, and, you know, somebody holding a compass near her. And I still have no explanation for why that happened, and I've talked to several other physicists, and we don't know what's going on there, but it was real, and Kathy did see it. And so Betty was a character. She was a social worker, very involved in the adoptions and so forth for the state of New Hampshire. She wasn't somebody who swept the floor. I mean, probably had to do that sometime too, but you know what I'm saying.
I do.
She was a respectable, professional person. Barney worked for the post office, but he was very active in politics. He was appointed to the Governor's Civil Rights Commission, for goodness sakes. And maybe I should point out, Barney was black, Betty was white, and that was rather unusual in New Hampshire in 1964.
Yes, it was, yeah.
You know, so, and people say, well, they were just looking for publicity. The last thing they wanted was publicity. And it was inadvertent that the story came out. Somebody violated a confidence. There's three parts to the story. One is the experience itself. The second is the next couple of years where they both developed physical ailments. Barney especially had ulcers and so forth. And they couldn't figure out why or what happened. And Barney went to a doctor for his ulcers. And the doctor tried everything, all the standard medications and stuff, and told Barney finally that I think you need to go to a psychiatrist. I can't do anything more for you. You may recall that ulcers were thought to be stress-induced, you know, psychological in basis, so to speak. So go to a professional. And by some lucky stroke, they wound up with Dr. Benjamin Simon,
So the second part of the story, the first is 2 years where they're trying to figure out what the heck happened. They finally located the spot where the abduction had taken place. They didn't know it was an abduction at that point. Just the 2 missing hours, and there were guys in the road, and they stopped the car, and then it's a blank. Okay, they go to Dr. Benjamin Simon. He treated them separately. Now, the best part of the story, and the reason for taking it so seriously, is Dr. Simon. Because, yes, he was a Harvard-trained psychiatrist, but during World War II, he operated a medical facility for people who had what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder from the war.
Right.
3,000 beds in that hospital.
Wow.
And so he worked out the techniques using hypnosis, very special, carefully done hypnosis, to get these people back amongst the living, so to speak. You know, your buddy's head gets blown off next to you in battle. That's hard to integrate.
It certainly is.
Him, you know what I'm saying.
Sure.
And people are coming back from the war now with PTSD.
Yeah.
Probably more today because they got better medical care over there in the battlefield, so more of them live. So Dr. Simon even stars in a movie called Let There Be Light that was put together to go over the techniques for treating this disorder. So we're talking about probably the top expert in the world on post-traumatic stress disorder, even though its title wasn't that, you know. So they were very lucky in that regard. Now, remember, his technique involved each of them being hypnotized separately. And they couldn't hear what was going on with the other one. They weren't there. Dr. Simon recorded all of this. But that's the technique he used, is he would have people relive a portion, the traumatic portion of their life. And then when they were ready, he'd play back parts of that. And he had a tremendous success rate. And I stress that because, you know, we're not talking parlor hypnotism here. And Kathy, knowing her aunt as having quite an imagination, and Betty wasn't afraid of anybody. She'd ask anybody anything.
Mm-hmm.
And the question that Kathy had in later years was all this story true? Because what came out under hypnosis was quite remarkable, that they'd been taken aboard a craft, that strange humanoid creatures had taken them on board, kept them in separate rooms, examined them, catch and release program, if you will. Took samples of skin and hair and stuff like that. And they were little guys, but they seemed to be able to control Betty and Barney, not forcefully, in other words, not putting a gun to their head or anything like that, but communicate telepathically and, told them they wouldn't remember what happened. And Betty screamed as they were taken off the ship, "I will do remember, and you'll be better off if you don't," said the leader. And so there's a fascinating story there, but Kathy's concern was, okay, how much of this is true?
Mm-hmm.
And she spent a great deal of time going over the tapes from the hypnosis sessions. They had 10 sessions each. A very significant thing here is that Dr. Simon had to stop one session each because the emotional milieu was just tough. He wasn't sure they could handle it. And he said in writing that the depth of their emotional involvement here was every bit as great as those of the shell-shock war veterans. That's the word I wanted, that he had treated. Coming from him, that really means something. Now, I should stress, they went through all this procedure, starting 2 years after the event. Simon taped all these sessions, played them back for them after a while. And that was kind of the end of it. Barney's ulcers were better. They talked a little bit about this to some small groups of people, about the total picture.
Right.
And remember, there was no abduction that had been reported prior to that they could copy. somebody said they just made it all up because of other, but there weren't any other at that time. This became the model, if you will. And of course, in time, people like Bud Hopkins have found many cases that predated the Hills, but that nobody knew about back then. I mean, you can imagine. Most people are afraid to report seeing a UFO.
That's right.
Now, a story in which suddenly you were taken on board a craft by strange beings and treated like specimens, you're not very likely to talk about that. You know? The fear of ridicule is real, and especially when you start talking about strange beings. So there had been no other case that got the publicity, the attention, and they certainly didn't need it. They got a call that somebody violated a confidence, and a reporter called Betty and wanted an interview. And about what? Well, about your flying saucer event. And, you know, absolutely not. She was afraid of losing her job. Barney's afraid of losing his job. Yeah. You know, if you're a social worker in a respectable community, the last thing you need is to be called a kook. You know, let's be realistic. This is 1960, well, 1 and then 3 and 4. And especially if you got a mixed marriage and they were both very active in the community. They didn't need this, you know. So the reporter, she said, absolutely not. And he wrote a story anyway.
Oh, for God's sake.
Yeah, and this was in the Boston Traveler, I guess it was called, the name of the newspaper. And the funny thing was, it got a good response. People were interested, and they didn't get fired. And John Fuller was in the area, so to speak. He wrote his book, Incident at Exeter, which is in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Just had the 50th anniversary of that, as a matter of fact. And heard because of the newspaper coverage. John had worked for Saturday Review. He was a professional, high-quality writer. And so they worked out a deal with Dr. Simon in the Hills, and he wrote his book, Interrupted Journey. And it did extremely well. It was a bestseller in many countries. And it put the Hill case on the map. And, you know, I have to admit that Donald Kehoe, the leader of NICAP for many years, and a proponent certainly of flying saucer reality and government cover-up, none of his saucers had beings on board them, you understand. You know, there were plenty of saucers flying around, and the government knew all about them, but no aliens. No aliens. We're not going to talk about aliens. And so this case, you know, pushed that notion aside. And it was a long time before NICAP dug into abductions. APRO was much more ready to. But the book came out in like 66, and in several countries. There'd been a big article in Look magazine, which was a big magazine back then. I guess it doesn't exist anymore.
I haven't seen it around for a long time.
No, I haven't either. And so things went on. And as I said, Barney died in 60. I met him in 68, died early 69. And the point of writing the book, which became Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experiences, was to update it because the original book didn't have the star map work, for example. It showed the star map, and, you know, that was a very peculiar part of the story. Nobody ever talked about something like this before. It turns out that Betty, in one of her hypnosis sessions, is talking about how she asked, and she asked the alien, "Where are you from? I know you're not from around here." Statement of the year. And so he shows her what I can only describe as a three-dimensional model. Points of light that were stars connected by three different kinds of lines. Heavy trade routes, light trade routes, occasional expeditions. And she's looking at this thing, maybe 2 feet by 3 feet. And she says, "Where are you on the map?" And he says, "Do you know where you are?" Wise guy alien. And she says, "I don't know anything about astronomy." "Well, how can I tell you where I'm from if you don't know where you're at?" End of discussion. Now, you can imagine Dr. Simon listening to this, and he asked Betty if she could remember what the map looked like.
Right.
This is under hypnosis. And he gives her a post-hypnotic suggestion. If and only if you can remember it accurately, please draw it later on. And she draws it at home afterward. And it turns out she's had a good 3D sense. And so the map is in the book, but no indication of what the heck it means. 16 stars connected with lines, That's a myth. I mean, it's a story. What are you going to do with it? You have no idea where anything is. Is the sun on the map or anything like that? And so it's a mystery that's in the book, Interrupted Journey. Now, Marjorie Fish had read the book and decided maybe there was something she could do to check on this. She had taken some astronomy courses in college, and she visited Betty to find out more about the map. And then she did something incredible. She built more than 20 three-dimensional models of our local galactic neighborhood. And the concern was obvious. You build a three-dimensional model, so you got all the stars in their right place, and you walk around it and see if you can find a pattern that matches the two-dimensional drawing that Betty had done. That's quite remarkable, and she was certainly not sure of whether there would be one. And she did have some problems with her cat, there were strings, fish line, holding the stars in the points of light.
Yeah.
And tangled with a few models. Anyway, Marjorie was reading the literature on what kind of stars would have planets. It sounds like a new discussion, doesn't it? Because there was no Kepler back then. We had no evidence of any other solar systems besides our own. And so, this is a first-time sort of chase. And after building all these models and looking at them from all different directions, she found one and correcting them, as astronomers said, well, those stars probably wouldn't have planets. And so you weed them out. Her first model had 256 stars in it. Can you imagine all the work that went into that? Like a 4-foot cube with these fish lines, anchored at one end, and the star, the light, at the appropriate three-dimensional location. A tremendous amount of work. And tedious work, too. And now, admittedly, how accurate can you be if you're going to cover, say, 50 light years in a 4-foot cube? You can't be to the nearest tenth of a light year. No way to do that. We had poor data on the distances of the stars. Astronomers weren't going anywhere. Who cares how far away a star is? You got two coordinates and you can look at it.
Yeah.
Whether it's 30 light years or 40 light years, doesn't matter. But if you're trying to do what Marjorie was trying to do, it does matter. So I met with her. I published the first article in Saga magazine, and it stirred up a great deal of discussion because the base stars turned out to be, as far as she could tell, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli. That's the constellation of Reticulum, which means the net. And you can't see it from here. I've often wished I was someplace where I could walk outside after the lecture and say, that's the place, right over there. You can't see it from above the equator, unfortunately. So one of the reasons for wanting to do the new book was to include the star map research that had been done, and also Kathy did something nobody else had ever done, a comparative analysis. Another part of the story here is that Betty had a series of dreams within a couple of weeks of the event, which included some maybe being abducted and stuff like that. And some people were trying to say that, the story that they told was just a reflection of Betty's dreams. Betty talked about them all the time, which is totally untrue. And that's all we're dealing with here. So what Kathy did, listening to the tapes, was to compare what Betty said and what Barney said in situations where they should have been saying the same thing. when you got taken out of the car, how many beings were there and how did they do it and so forth. And what she found was that whenever they should have been saying the same things, they were, even though this deviated from what was in the dreams. So it makes it much more likely that they were both telling the truth, since these hypnosis stories came out independently.
Right.
Either one was there when the other one was talking. So it made it for a very interesting study. Now, that Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli. Now, I have to admit, we had lousy data back then. The Gliese catalog was the best catalog, but not terribly accurate because it's hard to measure distances. Now, the European Space Agency had a satellite that made about 1 million measurements of star distances. And so we have much better data. And some of the numbers for the distances have changed somewhat. That doesn't change one of the key things about the base stars, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli, is they're the closest to each other pair of sun-like stars in our entire local neighborhood, meaning within, let's say, 50 light years of here. The sun from the next star over, Alpha Centauri, is, 4.3 light years apart. Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 reticuli are about 1/8 of a light year apart from each other. Now, that has some implications. One of them is, from a planet around one of them, looking over at the other star, it's visible all day long. You can imagine, we don't have any stars besides the sun that are visible during the day,
Yeah.
Secondly, you'd be able to make pretty good measurements of all kinds of things going over at that other place because it's so much closer than we are to anybody else, any place else. And the incentive, presumably, for developing interstellar travel would be greater when you got a next-door neighbor. Doesn't that seem reasonable?
It certainly does, yeah.
You want to go for a vacation, you want to set up a new colony, whatever. It's a much more concern when you got neighboring places. Even if there's nobody on the other one, it's a place you might want to go to when an asteroid hits you or something like that, or a war. We've had some, how shall I put it, ups and downs on our planet.
I hadn't noticed, yeah.
Yeah, and so Marjorie's work was really a great stimulus for people to think about things, and it was viciously attacked. People said, those were not just a random, you can always find a pattern if you just take a random look at stars. She didn't take a random look. She got the best data on where the stars were. So, anyway, I had published that, and you remember the Universal Studios did a television show starring James Earl Jones playing Barney back in 1975. Yeah. And I was living in Southern California at the time, and I was asked to be a consultant on that. Met with James Earl Jones and the whole crew. I thought they did a pretty good job. There were some things wrong, but as television telling of significant stories, I thought they did a darn good job.
Yeah.
I see stuff on television that I say, that ain't the way it was at all, man. So that was prelude. When Kathy finished this analysis of the tapes, she decided she really did want to do a book and was convinced that Betty, that the event really had happened as Betty described it. And yes, on occasion, Betty went out and saw UFOs where there weren't UFOs. There were lights in the sky and stuff like that. And it's recognized. And Betty took some pictures, and she didn't know anything about the camera she was using, a Polaroid where at night the exposure time is quite long, so it looks as if the thing you're looking at, when you look at the picture, it was moving, see? Well, it wasn't. It was the camera that was moving because the exposure time was long.
And in fact, we see that even today with people who take pictures of what they believe to be UFOs, and it's the camera that is opening up the iris to grab as much as it can that causes some of the pixelation or some of the wave movement.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, Betty was not a camera expert. There's no question about that. But what I'm saying is that it was time for the full story to be told, also covering what happened with Betty and Barney after the first story, after the first book came out. Betty lived to be 85. Barney was in his 40s. So she got a lot of attention, a lot of people giving her a hard time, a lot of people coming to her and wanting to report their sightings to her because it was safe. This fear of ridicule is something that's really important here. Okay, you can talk to somebody who claims to have been abducted by aliens. That's a lot easier to talk than to talk to somebody who is probably going to say, "What have you been drinking?"
Right.
And so Betty had other abductees come to her, and other, how will I put it, wannabe abductees.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anybody wants to be, but and as a matter of fact, she was very impressed with Travis Walton. She had a chance to meet him.
Yeah, he is a rather compelling young man.
Yes, he is.
Yeah.
He's not so young. Well, he's a lot younger than I am.
And I am, so let's be careful here, Stan. Let's be careful.
Yeah, Travis, I in this movie, UFOs Are Real, which included Marjorie Fish and Betty and Dr. Mitchell, we went to Arizona and interviewed Travis back in 1978. And then I was back when they were working on the new movie.
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer Stein has done a new movie called Travis, which was shown at the MUFON conference last week and a few other places. And it'll be in wide release, by the end of the year at least. And she's done a great job on it. And it was amazing. They were at first used a part of what I had been involved in filming back in 78. Gee, I really had black hair back then. Isn't that amazing?
I remember those pictures.
Dark black hair and beard and so forth. Who's that guy anyway?
You've aged well, my friend. You've aged well.
Well, I've got good genes. Both my parents lived to be 90, so I got another 9 years to go.
Plus.
He said.
9 years plus.
Yes. Yeah, well, progress comes from doing things differently, and I'm doing some nutritional things differently, so who knows? Not that we can control it, but genetics are important for age-related stuff. And so the point is that Betty had told Kathy that if she ever needed any help, talk to Stan Friedman. You can trust him, to be honest, and so forth. So that's why when she broached the subject, I said sure, because I've used the story in my lectures for years, because I was very impressed with the people, and because of the star map work, I've had to keep up on the story, so to speak. Because I'm a target too. If I'm going to talk about this all over the place, and there are people who aren't going to believe you, no matter what you say and what evidence you provide. You know that, and so do I. So we did the book. Now, let's face it. Kathy wrote 85% of the book. I did do the chapter on the star map and on the debunkers. I like debunking debunkers. And I've been out there, and so I've heard a lot of the arguments. When you're on the stage, you're fair game for anybody else.
You're a target.
That's right. And so far, nobody's thrown an egg or a tomato, and I've only had 11 hecklers and well over 700 lectures. So I must be doing something right, dodging well, I suppose you could say. And, working with Kathy inspired me. I did my own books, Crash at Corona. I wrote with Don Berliner. And I'm a late comer. I'm one of the Grandma Moses, who was that, the painter? Get started late of the UFO book business. And it took a while before I do a book on my own. And I did Top Secret Magic, and I did Flying Saucers in Science. And then Kathy and I had a lot of fun we did a book that was supposed to be entitled "It's Impossible, Isn't It?" But the publisher decided it was going to be "Science Was Wrong," and he had the right to change the title. So, not our title, but we had 14 chapters. We each did 7.
Mm-hmm.
And each one stimulated by some smart guy saying something very stupid. For example, Simon Newcomb, one of the great astronomers of the country in the early 1900s, made a statement that if there was one thing he was sure of, man would never fly any distance in a vehicle. That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. The British Astronomer Royal, 1956, space travel is utter bilge. A year before Sputnik, you understand. Kathy did some great stuff on... There's some fascinating medical stories where a lot of people died because the powers that be said, no, you can't stop smallpox with some kind of injection. What, are you kidding? Well, no, but a lot of people died because they refused. The powers that be weren't pushing inoculations, vaccinations, whatever you want to call them.
And still, even today, in the year 2015, you have people arguing the fact that vaccinations are necessary.
Yeah, oh yeah, and some people don't understand. It's not to protect you only. Maybe you have a choice, but how about all the other people that may get sick because you're not vaccinated?
That's right.
You know, there's a different way of looking at things. And Kathy did the story on Dr. In Europe, Semmelweis. And it's a fascinating story because it indicates how careful you have to be about listening to, quote, the authority figure. There was a big lying-in hospital in Vienna. And before that, women gave birth at home, midwives, etc. But now population centers and all that, they'd go to the hospital.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the women at this hospital who were being looked after by the midwives, only 3% got childbed fever, which was invariably fatal back then. This is in the 1830s or so. Mm-hmm. Of the women who were being treated by the doctors, 20% got childbed fever, which sounds really weird until you find out that the doctors would do autopsies on the top floor, come down and examine the women who were about to deliver and not wash their hands. The mark of a good doctor was how bloody his apron was.
Oh, for goodness sake.
It was pretty damn tragic, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And Semmelweis was concerned about this, and a friend of his got a needle stick at some point and came down with a lot of the same symptoms and died. No antibiotics or anything like that. And so Semmelweis did a lot of experiments with animals and stuff. And he set up rules, strong cleansing agent for your hands, a nail brush, all that sort of thing. And would you believe he brought the number of deaths down from 20% to 3%? And as a reward for his efforts, the head of the hospital fired him. We don't do things that way.
Unbelievable.
I'm not kidding. He published scientific articles, did experiments. And there are a lot of women and their babies that died because of this smart idiot. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But it's a story that makes you be very careful about jumping to conclusions. Well, somebody said, Lord Kelvin, X-rays were a hoax? What do you mean? Roentgen found invisible rays we didn't know about? Come on. It's a hoax. He's just trying to get attention. Roentgen was right, as it happens, not Lord Kelvin. We had 14 chapters, and it was fun doing, partly because both of us had to get up on some of these stories. I had never heard of Semmelweis before, for example. Kathy also did a chapter on what I'll call paranormal phenomena and looked at the scientific literature, the studies that have been published by people who, with regard to psychic phenomena, so-called. And a number of these, I hate the word paranormal, but I'm stuck with it. I don't know what else to call it. And where there were published papers, and the scientific community would act as if there weren't any published papers. And so I did a chapter on UFOs because you run into the same thing.
Sure.
The people who do their research by proclamation instead of by investigation. And so it's the book was an interesting experience, and I occasionally reread a chapter, and hey, that's good stuff.
Yeah.
I worried about thinking I won't like it if I reread it, but it was okay. So Kathy, now she's a social worker originally, and then involved in education. Not a scientist per se, but she has sure done some great work on abductions. At this MUFON conference that just happened a week ago, she did 2 sessions for experiencers, an hour and a half each, and 20 limit. There was a limit set on how many could be in each one. MUFON's finally taking a strong look at abductions, and people were so grateful that they could tell their story without worrying about, being ridiculed and laughed at, and the whole business.
Yeah, exactly, because that's what happens. They just keep on getting laughed at and ridiculed, and I think that a lot of the problem, Stan, stems from all the crap that's on the internet.
Well, you're probably right. Yes, the internet is a major problem in ufology. Pro and con.
Yes.
Some people want to believe everything that's on the internet, and I'm constantly being asked, well, I saw it on the internet. I saw it on YouTube. Yeah. And, they see me on YouTube. I don't put anything on there, but other people do when I get interviewed. Lord knows where some of this stuff, where people get it.
Mm-hmm.
But, sometimes I get sort of the reverse argument. Well, I see you on YouTube a lot. You mean you don't believe that stuff? I say, I don't put it on there. I need evidence.
Exactly.
And just because something makes it onto YouTube or on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And that goes both ways. As you know, I've done articles about ufology, the pro-UFO people who aren't telling the truth either.
Mm-hmm.
Fraud in ufology, I've done some articles like that. And it bugs people a little bit. They think because I give a lecture flying saucers are real, and I must think that anything anybody says about flying saucers is true. And I certainly do not.
What about all these different shows, Stan, that are on TV now? Are they, the so-called reality shows?
Yes.
Do they do more harm than good?
I don't know that they do more good than harm. It gets a lot of people talking where they otherwise wouldn't be, and maybe that's good. And, I check my audiences after a lot of my lectures anyway. How many people here believe they've seen what I would consider to be a flying saucer? I ask, having defined my terms earlier. And, the hands go up reluctantly. I just say, I'm just going to point and count. I'm not asking your name, and we didn't let the CIA in and stuff like that. And so I look to my left, and then gradually I point and count and point and count. By the time I get to my right, the hands go up rapidly, quickly, enthusiastically. The first hands go up reluctantly because each one thinks he's the only one.
Right.
And then it's 10% of the audience.
Wow.
10%. That's a huge number to me anyway. And sure, it's biased by the fact that they were willing to come to a lecture where some guy was going to talk about flying saucers, but still. But then I ask, how many of you reported what you saw? 90% of the hands go down. And the biggest reason people give me for not reporting, they come to my table, they got to tell me, because they know I'm not going to laugh,
Right.
They tell me their story, and I'll ask, did you report it? No, why not? They think I was some kind of a nut. And we have the crazy situation. I just tried this out in a classroom. The instructor and I got together. And we wanted the kids to vote with their eyes closed, so they weren't influenced by the other kids in the class. Just raise your hand or not. And 80% of the students in the class thought that most people didn't believe in UFOs. 80% of the students in the class did believe in UFOs. That tells you something. And look, I've only had 11 hecklers in well over 700 lectures in 50 states, 10 provinces, and 18 other countries. And 11 hecklers is a pretty small number, and 2 of them were drunk. I'm told by people in the audience.
I'm sorry. I tried to keep my producer away, but he insisted, so I'll take the blame for that one.
Oh, okay. You get that many critics, if you will, hecklers. If you talk about sports, religion, politics, probably more if you talk about any of those subjects. What I'm saying is, I have discovered that it's okay. I'm not a masochist. I don't go on the stage, and I've had crowds over 2,000, which is kind of, I enjoy the bigger the crowd. I'm a Leo. I enjoy being on the stage, But what I'm saying is that you learn very quickly that the attitudes are not anybody is a nut. They're not going to come at me like I'm a nut. Because I talk about flying saucers. Everybody thinks I get a hard time from the media, and I don't, from the audiences or the media. I spoke to Canadian Association of Journalists, some fancy title like that. Guy lives here in town, asked if I would speak at their convention, which was 60 miles away, and so we arranged it. And he told me later, he said, I've never seen so many reporters change their minds so quickly on something. They just hadn't realized how much evidence was out there. And I have another way of checking on that. I talk frequently about 5 large-scale scientific studies. And I show slides, PowerPoint, etc.
Right.
But then I ask, how many of you read this? And I'm lucky if 1 or 2% have read any of them. Now, it's one way of turning off the nasty, noisy negativists. If he's going to stand up and attack me, he's got to admit, well, I didn't read any of that stuff, So it's you can say a little sneaky, but why should I give a free platform to somebody who doesn't know anything? I have debated Coast to Coast Radio.
Mm-hmm.
I debated Dr. Seth Shostak. And Seth and I had met. We'd done a show together, and then we were both gave 3 lectures on the Queen Elizabeth II. We got a free trip from England to the United States. We listened to each other's lectures, and not much to do in the northern Atlantic in the wintertime.
But you know what? Speaking about Seth Shostak and SETI, we don't hear very much about them anymore.
Well, every so often as an article appears, and they're in the forefront of those who say, ain't nothing to UFOs, man. And people often ask me, well, how come, Stan? I think you'd be all for SETI. You're both looking for the same thing, aren't you? And I said, no. The basic rule for the SETI people is there ain't nobody coming here, man. We're going to listen for signals, and at least as long as I can work until I retire, and we know that someday we're going to pick up signals from aliens who, of course, are using technology compatible with our technology.
Yeah, that never made sense to me.
No, well, it doesn't make any sense. Look, the first long-distance radio signal on planet Earth was 1901, Marconi in Newfoundland, here in Canada. There's another example of bad science. The presumption was, look, radio waves move in straight lines. And in case you've forgotten, Stan, the planet is round. It's not flat. So that sets the limit on how far you can go and pick up a signal, because the signal will run into the Earth, of course. Well, Marconi had run some experiments with ships, and he found out that that wasn't true. And it was 20 years before we got the real reason it wasn't true. There's an ionosphere up there, and it reflects signals.
Sure.
They didn't know it was there.
And anybody who's ever done any CB work knows about a skip.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and that's exactly what a skip is.
Kind of neat things happen.
Yeah.
And so, there's another example of science was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Another one. The guy who discovered cosmic rays was doing innocent measurements of radiation levels as a function of height above the ground. They knew that there was uranium in the ground, and radioactivity had already been elucidated, if you will. And he started to do some experiments where we got up quite a bit higher, and the radiation levels went up. How could that be? You're farther from the ground. They've got to go down. Well, as a result of this work and careful measurements, and it took more than 20 years for this to be accepted, what he had discovered was cosmic rays coming in from the outside. And the closer you get to the top of the atmosphere, the less absorption there is, so the higher the level.
Yeah.
It's good science, but boy, were there people attacking him. Can't be right, because we know, and it's the ego that gets in the way. And there's a point of all this. It's easy to laugh at the people who make stupid comments. Smart people, the piled higher and deeper types,
sure, yeah.
PhDs. But much more important is, what else are we neglecting or not giving enough attention? What cures for diseases and so forth? The Brits were taking care of scurvy by feeding lemons, other, oranges, other things.
Citrus fruit.
To sailors.
Yeah.
It was decades before vitamin C was discovered.
Hey, Stan. Stan, I hate to do this, buddy, but we've run out of time for tonight.
Well, I'm terribly sorry about that. It's been fun.
No, sir, I'm sorry, because I appreciate you, Stan. And I want to thank you again for stepping in for Kathleen. And do me a favor, please give her our very best. And our thoughts
certainly will do that.
Our thoughts and our prayers are with her and her family at this time.
She does have a website. Just look up her name on the internet. You'll find it.
And, of course, Exo Nation, if you'd like to find out more about Stan, if you'd like to buy any of his books, his DVDs, they're available at StantonFriedman.com. Stan, take care of yourself, my good friend.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Good night, Stan. All right, Exo Nation. When I come back on the other side of this commercial break with the news, more in the X Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away.